всем. Я, наверное, представлю Аиду на русском сначала, потом перейдем на английский, поскольку Аида будет делать презентацию тоже на английском. Но вопросы и дискуссия может быть вестись хоть и на русском, хоть и на английском, или на кыргызском, как будет удобно, да? Так что спасибо большое за то, что вы пришли на сегодняшнюю презентацию. Идея этой презентации, она уже возникла у лондонского нетворка по Центральной Азии уже давно, и мы думали, что было бы очень хорошо, если бы мы представляли PhD, то есть людей, которые только что защитили свои докторские диссертации, получили статус PhD только недавно, и вот как раз Аида закончила свою диссертацию и защитилась буквально около месяца назад, поэтому мы ее позвали на эту презентацию. So basically, just very quick, short snapshot. Let me introduce Aida Alymbaeva, who is presenting today her PhD that she has defended just around a month ago at Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology and Martin Luther University Halle-Wittenberg. So her PhD dissertation was on contested Kalmak identity in Kyrgyzstan. So I'm not going to take the floor for too long, and I'll give the floor to Aida.
Okay, thank you, Guzat. Thank you very much for inviting me and for giving this chance to present my thesis for the wider audience, not only to the university where I have defended. Now I share my screen, okay, what have I? Share screen. Yeah, so I will be reading my text because the time is limited. So I delve in this thesis, I delve into certain processes of ethnic identification occurring in contemporary Kyrgyzstan. I analyzed the field data collected in and about the village of Chepek, a community associated with the Kalmak or Kalmak ethnic minority, and tightly intervened with the related concept of Sart-Kalmaks. I analyzed the politics and rhetoric of exclusion as a form of indirect power and practice of inclusion, minorities' politics of identity, within the domains of official registration, food, language, religion, epic, and descent. With that, you can switch directly to the fourth slide number 4. 1, 2, so this one. I based my analysis on the following concept of identity as a way of navigating oneself and relations in the social world. From such a position, ethnicity and nation become particular perspectives on that world, despite of looking on them as entities in the world. It makes them means of communication. Identity concepts are seen as available repertoire of meanings attributed to these concepts. Ethnic identification is understood here as a process of situational activation of one or another aspect of available repertoire of meanings packed within the related concepts. Next slide. My main tool of analysis was the examination of the semantic relationships between the aspects packed in the semantics of identity concepts. This allowed me insights into the politics of inclusion and exclusion, recognizing the ways how people refer to one or another aspect of identity at a given moment. When these dimensions are of similar meaning and may be sequentially referred to, and this can be schematically seen as this as well as that, then reference made syntagmatically, and then people expand their identity claims. When people reference to the meanings paradigmatically, it is when dimensions are seen mutually exclusive, such as either this or that. So then people narrow their identity claims. In some situations, relationships between the meanings can be used taxonomically, making something a kind of something else. Next slide. So Kyrgyzstan is an ex-Soviet Central Asian Republic with about 6 million of population and very active political life, where 5 presidents changed each other in 30 years. And today, Kyrgyz popular discourse actively exploits the rhetoric of being under threat by using references to the past to control access to power, and by narrowing that access with demands for pure Kyrgyzness. The thesis encompasses the strengthening Kyrgyz nationalist state-building project. One of the targets of this project is to find an enemy to place the blame for possible failures of this project. And this helps to legitimize the power of the Kyrgyz. The binary vision of us versus them has become dominating in this project. In Kyrgyzstan live various ethnic groups, and as a result of historical exchange of populations during last centuries, and the current state borders of the Kyrgyz Republic was inherited from the Soviet delimitation in the 1920s, and it includes a part of Fergana Valley that is densely populated by those who today known as Uzbeks, and who make up the largest minority today. Most of the studies of minorities in Kyrgyzstan focused on so-called salient minorities. One bunch of that literature studies Russians or Europeans, mainly in terms of their adaptation to changes in their statuses in the power balance after 1991. Another bunch of literature studies Uzbek minority, especially in terms of their political and cultural adaptation to the strengthening Kyrgyz nationalism. With my study, I contribute to the literature that focuses on small, rather unseen and ambivalent minorities, such as Kalmaks, as they are officially registered in the censuses, or Kalmaks, as Kyrgyz speakers used to call them. In popular Kyrgyz discourses, Kalmakness is often opposed to Kyrgyzness. So I analyze one of the cases when, citing Michael Herzfeld, nationalism expropriates the logic of ethnic belonging and turns it into an instrument of exclusion. Next slide. I explore how and why the Kalmak identity has been contested in Kyrgyzstan. During my fieldwork and after that, I kept wondering why the ideas of Kalmakness and Kyrgyzness were always appearing next to each other, and why were these ideas often accompanied by a mixture of multiple meanings and feelings of oppositions combined with strikingly obvious similarities. Next slide. Chepik is a village in the northern Kyrgyzstan, and visually an external visitor cannot find any differences from surrounding Kyrgyz settlements. As, for example, visually very obvious in the village Dishin, which is next to Chepik, whose population is widely known as Dungan. Of course, discursively, Kyrgyz visitors and neighbors always find something to catch up as different in Chepik. And my thesis is based on the results of my ethnographic fieldwork. It was all about participant observation, semi-structured interviews, but mainly I just followed the flows of talks over tea or staying on streets. And also I used genealogical methods to draw genealogical charts. And finally, I made a micro-census from 19 households to collect data on passport registration in relation to lineage belonging. In next slide. Thus, I focused on the meanings, interlinked and interchangeable uses of the concepts Kalmak, Sart-Kalmak, as they occur in the context of Chepik, in opposition to, and in some cases in parallel with the concept Kyrgyz in Chepik. I scrutinized these key concepts in the specific spatial temporal settings. The complex of meanings connected to these concepts reflect the history of centuries-long relations and cultural exchanges between the Mongol and Turkic-speaking populations and settled and nomadic ways of life. In the context of Chepek and its surroundings, these concepts may operate within two oppositions, Kyrgyz versus Kalmak and Sart-Kalmak versus Kalmyk. Variations within these oppositions dependent on situations in which they occur. Kyrgyz outsiders often highlighted and insisted upon the first opposition, positioning Sart-Kalmaks in alignment with Kalmak and Kalmyk. And the second opposition appeared mainly within the internal discourses of Chepek, where Sart-Kalmaks positioned themselves in alignment with Muslim Kyrgyz and in opposition to Buddhist Kalmyks. Next slide. In the literature about Chepek, Sart-Kalmaks have been described as people of Western Mongol origin who migrated to their current location in the second half of the 19th century and who used to speak a language called Kalmyk. Most of the authors who write about Sart-Kalmaks see them as a Kalmyk group in the process of Kyrgyzization. But there are a few others who see Turkic connections of Sart-Kalmaks as more important than their links with the Mongolian world. Most of the extant literature about Chepek has written from outsiders' perspective. As a result of statecraft, the two main terms, Kyrgyz and Kalmyk, became official statistic categories, and the term Sart-Kalmak is fixed in the academic literature. Next slide. The strongest factors influencing the maintenance of Kalmakness are the strengthening Kyrgyz nationalist discourse, the rigid concept of ethno-nationality inherited from the Soviet times, and continuous search for Kalmakness from outside the village that I call poking. I argue throughout my thesis that the idea of Kalmakness has been a notably contested one in Kyrgyzstan, because it carries adverse connotations as Kalmaks and who are still seen as the historic enemies of the Kyrgyz. The current Kyrgyz discourse highlights the otherness of Chepeki people, despite of their almost complete resemblance to Kyrgyz in their way of life, language, and religion. At the same time, the state institutionally encourages Chepeki people to register as Kyrgyz, thus facilitating becoming Kyrgyz. And the practice of intermarriages indicates the openness of Kyrgyz towards Sart-Kalmaks. In their turn, Chepeki people built their discourse of becoming almost Kyrgyz that grows over the other discourses, such as being Kalmak. I furthermore assert that it is not only by discursive means that the people of Chepek can claim that they are becoming Kyrgyz. They do not have to pay high costs for this change. Due to the small size of their population, there was great pressure to be assimilated by the bigger and dominant and culturally similar Kyrgyz group. These two major discourses operate within the same semantic fields of key concepts. These meanings in the context of Chepek can be contradictory or plausible within each other, creating situational tensions between them. This ambivalence has become a source for making such claims of becoming Kyrgyz additionally to the processes of culturally pooling by the Kyrgyz via marriages and building kinship structures. The claims and rhetoric of identity are produced and reproduced in the context of constant dialogue and dispute between the claimants of Kyrgyzness and Kalmakness. To make such a complex argument, I have analyzed the process of identification within and in various domains and dimensions of identity. Next slide. I suggest that despite the stability of the Kyrgyz discourse that construct the Sart-Kalmaks as ethnic others, Kyrgyz remain in practice open to Chepeki people in an institutional sense, facilitating the integration of Cherpeki people by encouraging them to register as Kyrgyz on their passports. Sart-Kalmaks yet have an ambivalent position in view of the state, as they were to be registered under Kalmyk nationality for censuses starting the Soviet time. And they were consequently Kalmyks for the purposes of passport registration. I showed how people in Cherpek used the spectrum of semantic of key concepts to explain their passport identities, and that passport identities often do not match the identity claims that individuals pronounce in various situations. Next slide. The bordering lines can always be moved hither and thither within the dimensions of language and religion. My interlocutors could stress one or another variation of identity, or even both simultaneously. They used language to delineate Kalmakness, or to put it more precisely, the memory of the practice of Kalmyk language, because there are just a few elderly can speak it today. But in the realm of religion, Islam, they were adamantly definite in their associations of the self with Kyrgyz. Next slide. Another dimension within which identity can be tasted is a safe zone for expressing cultural difference. While the Cherpeki food culture has become practically same with the Kyrgyz settlements, there are three dishes that people of the village articulate as their special language. The narratives around these dishes are called their own food accent. As far as outsiders will look for otherness, as far as the market need for bread will be there, and finally, but importantly, so far as the state will support tourism, ethnic flavor of these dishes and as different from the Kyrgyz will continue to be there. Next. References to narratives about the past for making various identity claims are one of the richest soils for purposes of inclusion and inclusion. Heroic epic is a universal source for nationalistic and nationalizing narratives, and it is the same in Kyrgyzstan with the epic Manas that is being brought into the center of national ideology. And it is a successful project so far, but not for Sart-Kalmaks. While they are linked to Western Mongols, part of which were called Jungars in the past, and Kyrgyz collective memory calls Jungars as Kalmaks today. I analyzed 4 versions of Manas epic and discourses based on it from both sides, the Kyrgyz and Sart-Kalmaks, and I suggest that in the context of Cherpek, the narrative related to the modern Kyrgyz national founding myth became the space where boundaries between Kyrgyzness and Kalmakness are produced and reproduced. People of Cherpek, the most common version of the Manas epic talks about Kalmaks as the main enemies of the Kyrgyz. Many Kyrgyz have metonymically transferred the epic guilt onto the opponents of Cherpeki origin, and the very name Kongurbai, that is named a Kalmak hero, has become, I suggest, a wispy floating line delimiting Kalmakness and Kyrgyzness, not only in discourses about and around Cherpek, but in the national discourses as a whole. Next slide. The most striking fact I encountered among people in Cherpek during my fieldwork was a desperate need for and search for the historical truth of their origin. My interlocutors hoped finding that truth would help them to answer the question, who are we in fact? This question was often imposed from outside of the village. In 2 chapters, I delved into the ways in which the current active growth and popularization of genre of Kyrgyz genealogies called Sanjira and the growing political associations within patrilineages influenced Cherpek. It has not only affected identity discourses in Cherpek, but it initially encouraged Cherpeki people to construct their kinship organizations in very similar ways as Kyrgyz. To make kinship organizations in the village took the form of patrilineally structured lineages in parallel with the Kyrgyz villages. It has also led them to build links with co-lineals from around Kyrgyzstan. Under the influence of Sanjira, people of Chirpik have begun to portray themselves as Kyrgyz in both cultural origin and social organization. Next slide, please. I explored the records of genealogists from Chirpik, placing them in chronological order to trace the core plot of the story of origin shared in Chirpik. This story tells about 4 Muslim men, supposedly 2 Sart and 2 Kyrgyz, who were compelled to live among the Kalmaks and marry Kalmak women in the past, and these 4 men grounded Sart-Kalmaks. I indicated how this co-plot has made its way through time along the path of changing political frameworks, what shifts in each text were made in this process, and how these changes influenced the final plot, and as it was told to me in Chirpik. I compared this text in terms of their main themes and their presentation of the village story of origin, and I displayed how discussion of Chirpiki identity have shifted during the period from the early 1930s to the 2000s, and how they underwent the change in focus from Kalmakness to Sart-Kalmakness, and finally coming to Kyrgyzness. Next slide. In last empirical chapter, I analyzed the meeting that was held in building of local administration in June 2012. Its principal theme was the search for the truth of the villagers' origin, for an accurate definition of their actual ethnic belonging. For this, one of the older village intellectuals proposed that ethnicity affiliation should be based strictly upon the criterion of the patrilineal descent principle. This proposal was heavily contested at the meeting. People references and emphasis reflected their identity choices made at that given moment. This also shows the dialogic character of identity claims, the relationship between internal polemics and the villagers' arguments in response to the claims from outside. I demonstrated how my interlocutors have creatively built their theories of identity. They reacted to the contemporary changes they faced. They were not simply transmitting their knowledge of the past and identity, but actively engaging in its production and reproduction. The regular external interest in Kalmakness means that each and every outsider who enters Chirpik every time pokes or disturbs the local people. This means that when the villagers are asked for information about the village, they act not just as providers of information, but as entrepreneurs of their identity. Not only do they provide information of data about identity, but they suggest in addition their own theories of identity. Their theoretical choices in this regard are eclectic. They act as primordialists when perceiving nations and minorities as fixed and given entities. And also they act as constructivists when creatively combining certain aspects of semantic fields for their identity theories. Next slide. Finally, I suggest that the concept of ambivalence be used for the purpose of marking the processes involving 2 or more poles of identity choices that may or may not contain contradictory meanings that create tensions between them. Overcoming this tension is possible when semantics of concepts contain contradictory but also contextually plausible meanings. The ethnographic perspective in this case follows an insider vision as much as possible to avoid extrapolations of visions from outside. In the power imbalance between the dominant and minority groups, Sart-Kalmaks' discourses of becoming Kyrgyz are cases of politics of identity. The ambivalence in case of Chirpik is about a desire to be or not to be Kalmak or Kyrgyz. However, there could not be only one single clear-cut response to this desire. Next slide. Coming back to my main research question, how and why the Kalmak identity has been contested in Kyrgyzstan. My study shows that for an individual who identifies him or herself as Kyrgyz, it is hardly possible to link or think of himself as Kalmak. For Kyrgyz, there is always exists a clear opposition, Kyrgyz versus Kalmak. But for someone from Chepik, this option is an ambivalent one, because he or she may think of himself or herself as a Kalmak, a Kyrgyz, Sart-Kalmak, or even altogether simultaneously at some situations. My research indicates that categorization Kalmak Kyrgyz is not an absolutely fixed one. It is flexible in a way that allows an actor, such as a Chepik inhabitant, to move the boundaries back and forth by deploying various criteria, such as language, religion, lineage. It is because people in Chepik have several ways with which to locate themselves in terms of ethnic identity. For them, it is not only a matter of contestation, but also one of integration, interaction in creative use of meanings that packed within semantics of concepts. Next slide, please. So, when looking at ethnicity and nation as a means of communication that is seen, that means to see them as knowledge packed and structured within semantics of ethnic and cultural concepts. This knowledge embraces traces of historical cultural exchanges. It is transmitted within socialization and shaped by overarching social and political frameworks that are also changing. I suggest that an individual has an agency to influence this knowledge when using it according to the current needs under and sometimes despite of the influences of external frameworks such as power discourses. Boundaries of semantic fields of related concepts may demarcate the ethnic boundaries, overlap with them, or be narrower or wider. Spaces of intersection and juxtaposition of semantic fields of concepts become spaces of intersection and juxtaposition of ethnic boundaries. These spaces in between become spaces where cultural production of boundaries is produced and reproduced, where such boundaries are discussed and contested, and thus where they can be observed. These spaces have potential for flexibility and elasticity of ethnic cultural references, and thus for projections of identities. When dominant ethnic majority tends to highlight differences of a small minority without much of visual differences, ethnicity becomes more of a kind of a discursive knowledge. Categorization happens when people talk and when the talk becomes a social action such as blaming. In this sense, my thesis contributes with not only exploring meanings of ontological categories such as Kalmak identity, but also the ways how people use those categories to build their theories reflecting their interpretations of social reality. This knowledge helps an individual to suppose possible ways of action or reaction on his/her action or an act of speech, or to realize someone's fixed vision of his or her. It is when a Chepeki person realizes that even if they try to assure that they becoming Kyrgyz, there always be those here Kyrgyz who would point out their Kalmakness. And last slide, please. To conclude, I formulated here the main conceptual questions that led my research. My thesis contributes to the body of that literature which seeks answering these questions. How people see, experience, and interpret the social world. How people categorize themselves and each other in their discursive and narrative practices. Thank you very much. Last slide can be shown there on the photos. Thank you very much. These are people from Chepek with whom I lived together, who shared their ideas with me. Thank you, Guzat, for helping with presentation with PowerPoint.
Thank you, Aida. Can I stop sharing that?
Yeah, now.
Thank you so much for this presentation. Very interesting dissertation. And I will open the floor for questions or comments, critique, anything. Yeah, I can see the hand by Erika.
Thank you so much, Aida. It was so interesting to listen, and it's really important to just contribute to knowledge, expand our knowledge on minorities that are understudied still. So you talk about how Uzbeks and Russians, and sorry, that's a cat in the background, are studied. So my, as you know, my father's side is from Chepek as well. And one of the mysteries, and we know so little about our history, so one of the mysteries for me has always been, were Kalmaks or Sart-Kalmaks, were they ever forced to take Kyrgyz identity in order to survive? And I'm thinking especially during the Second World War, during Stalin, did it happen that they in order to survive, they had to rewrite their identities on their documents? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Erika. This is an important question, and it reflects the main discursive flows that are actual and active in Chepek. In fact, I would say that there are different actors and there are different entrepreneurs of identity in Chepek. So most of the people who live now in Chepek, they prefer to say that from the beginning they were mixed. It was a mixture. So they now highlight the story of origin that is a mixture of ethnicities from the very beginning. And those who do not, this is from what I have from my field, those who do not live in Chepek now, who left Chepek decades ago and now live mostly in Chepek, in Bishkek or outside of Kyrgyzstan, and who are, let's say, socially a bit of higher, yeah, like those who at Soviet time they had higher education and higher positions, who do not depend very much on those with whom they live, actually. So they do not have this kind of fear to talk about Kalmakness. And among these educated people, the discourse about forcing, that the Kyrgyz forced them to become Kyrgyz, is one of the popular threads of discourses. But as I said, because the size of this group was very small from the very beginning, it was one village by the time of migration. And from the very beginning, culturally, the people who migrated from Tekes, from Xinjiang at the end of 19th century, the way of life and the mode of production, let's say, they were mostly of nomadic people, was very similar to Kyrgyz. So it is a kind of natural process that the Kyrgyz way of life and thinking and language just became dominant. That's just happened. And also plus religion. So now what people in Chepek, those intellectuals in Chepek, what they stress is that from the very beginning, religion, Islam, was the main defining factor to live from Xinjiang to Kyrgyzstan, to this territory. And also the factor that united them and kept them together. during the deportation, as a result of deportation in 1943, when the Kalmyk people from Kalmykia were deported to Siberia, this also affected people from Chepek, of course. And even by the time, those who were originally from Chepek, they were removed from the front line of army and put into the lager. And one of the main discourses now in Chepek is that the intellectual from Chepek, he wrote letters to Stalin, and he convinced Stalin that actually we do not Kalmyks, we have no connections to Kalmyks, but we are part of Kyrgyz people. So I would say that everything is so discursive, and that the discourses, very different ideas and attachments to the past, very different points from the past have been used for different claims. I would say that the Kyrgyz themselves, during the Soviet time, were the minority people. Like they politically were minority people. So they were also, as well as Kalmaks, Sart-Kalmaks, under all the policies, nationality policies that have been applied during the Soviet time. So I wouldn't say that the process of forcing to become Kyrgyz was there intentionally made. Yeah, it is kind of the process that happened on the way alone.
More politically.
More politically, yeah.
Thank you, Aida.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can see a hand raised by Nurbek as well.
Hi again, Aida. Thank you very much. It was really interesting to listen and watch the presentation. I studied identity from the perspective of stigmatized invisible identities and how they are experienced from the perspective of security scapes. So my question to you is, can you elaborate more, like whether you observed if people from Chelpek who lived in Chelpek and when they were outside of Chelpek, for example, would they conceal their Kalmakness, or when would they disclose it? And to what would it be linked to? Would it be that when their identity is threatened, they would conceal it, but then when they would be in a safer environment with other Kalmaks, they would be eager to experience it and more disclose it?
Yeah. Thank you for question. I think my reply will be connected to Erika's question too, that in general, as I told about, that the Kyrgyz nationalist rhetoric uses blaming with reference to the epic Manas. Yeah, so the popular Kyrgyz discourse keeps memories of the Jungar invasion as the most fresh. How's it? Вражеский. Is the most fresh enemies from the history. And Sart-Kalmaks have been seen in general as Kalmaks, as the direct descendants of those Jungars who have been killing Kyrgyz in the past. Same with Kazakhs, by the way. Yeah. And the history, the documents doesn't the history doesn't have a clear answer on that. Yeah, there are elaborations on the connection to the Oirats, actually. Yeah. And this question I left to the historians who would dig into that. But what is happening today that, yes, in Karakol, but mostly, let's say this way, as far distance from Karakol towards Bishkek, so far people, especially young people, they tend not to tell that they are from Chepik. They tell that they are from Karakol, usually. And only when it comes to closer discussions, especially with men, because men usually are interested now with all this Sanjira genealogy stuff. Only when talking in closer talks, it can be revealed that the person is from Chepik. So then only those Kyrgyz-speaking people who knows this fact that Chepik is related to Kalmakness. So then it can come up in discussions. So it all very situative, but in general, young people tend not to highlight that they are from Chepik when they are in Bishkek or in Rabache, in Balchi, for example. But in Karakol, I wrote in chapter about language that in Karakol people tell, and in close surrounding of Chepik, that they can recognize Chepeki people because they have their special accent. So I would say yes and no on your reply.
Thank you. Thank you.
In the south, for example, in south, in Osh or Jalalabad, the topic of Kalmakness is not that high and not that vital, because it is a bit far from the area where Jungar invasion had place in the past. Yeah, it is more on the northern part. And in south, there are other ethnic others to whom pay attention. There are Uzbeks and Tajiks there to whom to talk about. So there, if you say they are from Chepik, it wouldn't make any sense. Only if you are talking to someone who is a specialist on genealogies. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? If you're just still thinking, I might have one question to Aida. So when you were talking about different theories, local theories of, identities, you also said that there is one that people refer to, and it's called, you called it as Kuramael, or people refer to it. Mm-hmm. So can you just expand on it a bit more? Because it seems like if you're coming from a different context, not exactly like Chilpek and Karakol area, but trying to relate that idea of Kuramael to different contexts. Let's say, I live in London and it's very multicultural, multi-ethnic, mixed ethnic, etc., etc. So would it relate to something, to this kind of context, like, what Kuramael in the understanding of, so I'm interested basically what Kuramael is in understanding of Kalmak people, and would it relate then to some like other kind of context where there's like, mixture happened? Thank you.
Actually, the idea of mixture is very central in many post-Soviet and post-colonial contexts, yeah? And it has been used in political narratives as well, and it's also situational. When you need to stress something that have a potential to unite anyone or anything, so you stress on the mixture. In Kyrgyzstan, this discourse of Kuramael now is being brought in the attempts to suggest variation for national identity to unite Kyrgyzstani people, yeah? And in the context is in Chepik, the point of Kuramael is an acute one, because this is the way how to reply, how to respond to this constant blaming from the Kyrgyz on the otherness. This constant use of Kalmakness as making for the exclusive purposes. Mostly it is on the discursive level. And this idea or story of origin that is now very being spread in Chepik about 4 founding men who supposedly were Kyrgyz and Salts, who married Kalmyk women. And but they were Muslim people. So this version of identity theory about the mixture, or I call it assembled people, is about that from the very beginning, we were different. We had different ethnic origins from the very beginning. So that's why we cannot stress only one identity over the other one. And that intellectual who was main provider of this idea, he referred to many similar situations when mixed, culturally mixed, ethnically mixed people live. And he was saying that we cannot choose only one over another ethnic root. We can, and he said, what keeps us together is the oath that our ancestors gave when they were moving to this place. Oath to be always together, never separate, and unite. And this idea of being assembled people kept together with religion Islam and with this oath. This was the theory. And a commentator on my thesis, he lives in Switzerland, and he wrote that actually today's national rhetoric is based on similar point, that we are assembled nation which is united with the law, with this kind of oath to stick together. Yeah.
It does relate to many different contexts because
yeah, as I said, maybe everywhere in the whole world. The only thing is that sometimes the dominant political group would like to stress something else, like in Kyrgyzstan. Kyrgyz wants to stress Kyrgyzness and to live outside of Kyrgyz, those who cannot prove Kyrgyzness through the links, through the lineage links. So this is what.
If you allow me, can I ask one more question? Because you mentioned also about exclusions, and I don't think you did focus too much on that in the presentation. So what are the, how does it feel to be excluded then? Because in passports, if they're Kyrgyz, and it's only very slight, difference in terms of accent and everything. So how do then Kalmak people feel being excluded?
Main point that I would like to make with my thesis is that exclusion is discursive. So the popular Kyrgyz discourse wants to exclude, to stress the otherness, to limit possible access to power to everyone who may be seen as ethnic other. But in practice, Kyrgyz people are open, like institutionally, as I said, through passport practices, and also through marriages are very much open. But inside of Chepik, the discourses of exclusion are also very popular. People mainly tell about that if you register yourself as Kalmyk, you would not have access to education, to higher education, to high position posts, etc. And I think this is what regards education is coming from the Soviet times when the access of rural people to get to the universities was limited. And also when to get to study, let's say in central universities in Moscow, there was nationalная quota. So you should be Kyrgyz if you are representing Kyrgyzstan. So, but there is a discourse, it is still strong discourse that we are being excluded, that the Kyrgyz do not let us to get to the good positions. And it also somehow true because we have many cases when the Kyrgyz started to dig Sanjira, to dig genealogy, to look for pure Kyrgyz lineages in the father lines of any politician person. We all remember how Akayev was called Kalmak, or Kurmanbek Bakiev was told about that he is related to Dungans, or etc., etc. So this is all the basis to keep this exclusive rhetoric.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Erika, I think, have a question.
Yes, I have a question and a comment, Aida. I think when you say Kyrgyz people, both during the Soviet period and now, I think it's important to separate between just common people, what their attitudes, and what the government does for political purposes. So when we talk about the Soviet period, we're not really talking about Kyrgyz people didn't, trust Kalmaks. It's really Stalin and Stalin's nation-making policies that was kind of implemented on the republic level, or even like on the village level. So I think it's an important separation between what people feel and what conditions they are forced to live in by oppressive governments. I don't know what you think, but I know we're out of time. But yeah, thank you. This is wonderful discussion.
Yeah, it's an important point, and the thesis is mostly about common people, about like ordinary people in Chepek. Yeah. And when I say about Kyrgyz discourse, I say about Kyrgyz popular discourse. Yeah, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Guza.
I mean, I will let maybe one more person to ask a question if you want to, but if not, we can stop recording. Thank you so much, Aida. And congratulations again with defending your PhD, because it's a big success. And as I said before at the beginning, it's not always celebrated as widely as possible. This is also another, this is the event to celebrate such a success. And hopefully you can publish your book as well.
Thank you, Guzat Rahmat. Thank you. Thank you, Rita.